It started with smoke thick, black, and rising fast into the cold evening sky. People on main streets stopped what they were doing and looked up. A two-story building, once a small art shop, was burning. Flames licked out from the second-floor windows. Glass cracked. An alarm howled. It was loud and sharp, but it didn't stop people from pulling out their phones. Some recorded, others whispered, but no one moved closer. Everyone stood still, frozen, watching something they didn't want to touch. Across the street, an old man with a rough beard and a patchy green coat looked up from his bench. His boots were worn, soles flapping slightly with each step. He limped toward the smoke, slow but steady. Most people didn't notice him. They never did. The heat hit his face, but he didn't flinch. He moved past the reporters, past the shocked bystanders, and walked straight into the burning building like he belonged there. He looked like someone who hadn't had a home in years. Someone who lived in alleys, slept under bridges, and talked only to ghosts. No one knew his name. They called him the Vet, or the Ghost Man. Some even crossed the street when they saw him coming. But now he wasn't walking away. He was walking toward the fire. A woman shouted, "Hey, where are you going?" His eyes were wide. "That was Frank," he muttered. "Frank Doyle. He lives behind my store, sleeps near the dumpsters." He didn't answer. He was in the army, I think. A long time ago. But inside that building, no one knew what was happening. The fire didn't wait for questions. It didn't care about heroes. And it definitely didn't pause for people like him. They didn't know that an old man who had done spoken more than 10 words a day had just walked into hell with nothing but an old coat and a limp. A man filmed and said, "Yo, this guy's crazy." Still no answer. The crowd parted slightly, unsure whether to stop him or just watch. Without a word, the old man stepped off the curb, crossed the road, and slipped through the yellow tape like it wasn't even there. People gasped. Should they film the fire? The firefighters, the building that might fall, or the space where the old man had vanished? He didn't look scared, the boy whispered. He looked like he knew what he was doing. One firefighter, just arriving, ran forward, but it was too late. The old man had already disappeared into the smoke. "Did he just go inside?" someone said. "He's gonna die," another whispered. The camera phones kept rolling. The fire grew louder, as if angry. Flames punched through the roof, wood snapped. Sirens screamed in the distance, finally getting closer. A sharp cracking noise, like wood being thrown aside, and then a cough. Someone was inside, still alive. Back across the street, the deli owner stood in the doorway with a dish towel in his hand. "You know him?" someone asked. The deli man nodded slowly. "Why'd he go in there?" The deli man didn't answer. He just stared at the flames. The fire truck pulled up. Firefighters jumped out and rushed to the hoses, but they didn't know someone was already inside. "What is he doing in there?" a teenage girl asked. Her mother pulled her close. "He's no one, honey. Just someone who lost his way." But not everyone agreed. A boy about 11 years old looked up at the flames, then back toward the building. No one responded. The reporters had their cameras aimed, but they didn't know where to point. For 2 minutes, nothing changed. 3 minutes. 4. Then, a sound faint but clear rose above the fire's roar. People turned toward the building's side entrance. A shadow moved behind the smoke. Someone was coming out. A small figure, then a larger one behind it. And in that moment, the crowd stopped breathing, because what came out of that fire wasn't just smoke and ash. It was something no one expected, not even the reporters, who had seen everything. The cameras shook as the figure stepped into view, half covered in smoke and soot. His coat was scorched, the edges black and curling from the heat. His boots looked half melted. His breath came in short gasps, but his arms were strong, one wrapped protectively around a little girl. Everyone was yelling, but the man didn't seem to hear them. He just looked at the girl once, gave a small nod, and sat down hard on the sidewalk, like his legs finally gave out. His hands trembled, but not with fear, with something deeper. Maybe memory, maybe pain. Her cheeks were streaked with ash, and she coughed into his chest as he lowered her gently to the ground. 68 years old. Once a U.S. Army medic, once a husband, once a father. He carried his life in a torn backpack held together by duct tape. Inside were a pair of gloves, a faded photo of a young boy in uniform, and 3 cloth patches, one shaped like a shield. one with a red cross, and one that simply read, Doc, once a man with medals in a drawer and stories he never told. People shouted. Paramedics rushed forward. The girl was alive. That he once held a soldier's hand while mortar exploded around them, whispering. She had wandered upstairs during a birthday party and got trapped when the flames spread too fast. Her parents had no idea she wasn't outside. Firefighters hadn't even gotten inside when Frank acted. If he had waited just 2 more minutes, she wouldn't have made it. You're going to be okay, even when he knew it wasn't true. That he stayed behind in a bombed-out shelter to treat civilians. When the evacuation order had already been given, Porter snapped photos like fireworks. He'd buy day-old bread, maybe a small coffee if he had the change. Kids sometimes teased him. Adults ignored him. Never argued, never shouted, never asked for help. Some left flowers. Others brought posters that read, Thank you, Frank. Kids drew pictures of a man in a green coat saving a girl from flames. A firefighter crouched beside him. Sir, are you all right? Can you tell us your name? A bus driver recalled him giving his seat to a tired mother. He didn't ask for anything. It's not praise, not money, not even a warm place to stay. A teacher said Frank once stood outside the school gate during a storm, helping kids cross the flooded sidewalk. The old man didn't answer. He stared at the cracks in the pavement, eyes distant, somewhere far away. The name stitched onto his chest pocket was barely visible beneath the ash. Doyle. That was all someone needed. Within hours, his name was whispered across the city. And by morning, it was known across the country. Frank Doyle. Now, a man who slept behind a deli, near old milk crates and forgotten newspapers. Frank didn't talk much. The deli owner said he only nodded once in a while. No one knew that the man they passed by every day once dragged a bleeding sergeant 300 feet through enemy fire. No one knew, because Frank never told them. He didn't need to. What he did in that burning building told the whole story. The little girl he rescued, her name was Emma, 7 years old. I saw the smoke and heard someone crying, he finally said when a nurse asked him in the hospital. You ran in without gear or help, she replied. Why? Frank shrugged. It's what we did. Just 3 words, but they said everything. Back at the fire scene, people who had once ignored him now stood where he sat. Still, not everyone believed it at first. He was homeless, one man said to a reporter. Could have been dangerous, could have been drunk, but others began sharing stories. A store clerk remembered Frank handing back a lost wallet. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. He wasn't just some man who walked into fire. He was a soldier who never stopped saving people living. When the world stopped seeing him. But even after the news spread and cameras chased his story, Frank didn't change. He just asked one thing, is the girl okay? When told she was, he nodded once. That was enough. Right. But for the rest of the city it wasn't. Because they were just beginning to realize how much they had missed, and what was still hidden in the smoke. Before the fire, Frank Doyle was just a shadow. People walked past him every day. Some turned their faces. Others crossed the street. He was the man near the alley, sitting on an old milk crate with a blanket over his shoulders and a paper cup by his feet. Most didn't know his name. To them, he was just another homeless guy. He never begged, never shouted. When she came back and it was gone, she blamed Frank. She called the store. They kicked him off the sidewalk. Later it turned out another man had taken it. No one apologized. He just sat quietly, looking at the world like someone who had already seen too much of it. One morning, a teenager at the coffee shop spilled hot chocolate near Frank's blanket and didn't even say sorry. Frank just moved his things silently. The boy didn't look back. A woman once left a bag of groceries on the bench nearby. Not because he wanted to be, but because the world had stopped looking. The deli owner, Mr. Santiago, was one of the few people who spoke to Frank. He'd offer him a sandwich on cold days or extra coffee from the morning rush. He doesn't talk much, Santiago told a reporter later. But he always says thank you. Always. With a folded American flag he kept wrapped in plastic. When a reporter asked if he wanted to tell his story, he shook his head. It isn't about me, he said softly. It's about a little girl who still gets to live. Every time a door didn't open. Every time someone looked through him like he was glass. Or the picture of a young woman with soft eyes and a child on her lap. A little boy mailed him a drawing of a superhero wearing a green coat and boots. A man was sleeping near a dumpster. She left a sandwich beside him without saying anything. A teenager at the bus stop saw a man in a worn coat struggling with bags. He helped carry them without being asked. Frank looked at it every night before closing his eyes on cold concrete. Still, even Mr. Santiago didn't know Frank's full story. No one knew about the medals buried in a shoebox. He just wanted people to look differently next time to see the person sitting on the ground, not the problem. But when one of them walks into a fire to save a child, suddenly we want to know their name. That says something about us, not just him. He had been invisible for years. Until the fire. They still didn't understand what it truly cost him to walk into that fire. How could someone like him go unnoticed for so long? Why didn't we know who he was? The answers weren't easy. The fire changed everything. They had forgotten that every person living on the edge once had a story, a home, a reason, a name. Now people asked questions, because people had stopped caring. They'd stopped listening. A reporter from Channel 7 said, "We walk past these men every day." The mayor held a press conference. He called Frank a hero, promised to do more for veterans, promised to check on the homeless in the city. But promises don't erase years of silence. In the hospital, Frank stayed quiet. He didn't want speeches or flowers. Outside his room, cards and letters piled up. Veterans across the country sent messages. A retired general called to say thank you. And still, Frank stayed quiet, because part of him remembered every moment people had ignored him. He didn't want revenge, didn't want guilt. And deep down, some people did begin to change. One woman walked past the same alley a few days later and paused. A shift had begun, not loud, not quick, but real. Still, for Frank, the fire wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a deeper test. Because while the world had started noticing him, they didn't know what ghosts he carried with him. They didn't know what happened inside those flames. But they were about to. The smoke was thick, black like oil, wrapping around Frank's face and pulling at his lungs. Each breath burned. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when he heard the sound, soft at first, like the squeak of a mouse, then louder, a cough, a cry. Somewhere in the back of the building, a child was alive. Frank dropped low, crawling across the warped floorboards, one hand pressed against the wall to guide him through the dark. He moved like someone who had done this before because he had. Not in houses, but in tents, under gunfire, in bunkers during bomb raids, in smoke-filled trenches where shouting meant giving away a position. Wood popped and cracked above. His coat was soaked with sweat. His eyes stung from ash, but still, he kept moving. Then there. "Keep breathing," he whispered, unsure if he was talking to the child or himself. He turned back toward the exit, but the path was worse now. The fire had spread across the ceiling, raining sparks. The sidewall was beginning to collapse. A piece of burning wood fell across the hallway. Frank didn't stop. He kicked it aside with what strength he had left, shielding the girl with his arms. Frank pulled him out, dragging him 300 yards under sniper fire. Miller survived. They all did that day. The heat pressed against his back. Bricks tumbled down. Frank twisted his body, taking the hit on his back to protect the girl. The pain nearly knocked him over, but he kept his feet. He leaned into it with careful pressure, shifting it just enough to free her. She whimpered but didn't scream. Her tiny fingers reached for his arm and he scooped her into his chest, wrapping his coat around her face. And then they were out. Frank stumbled into the sunlight and dropped to his knees. The girl slipped from his arms into the hands of waiting paramedics. He collapsed forward, coughing, arms burning, the smell of smoke buried deep in his skin. The girl stirred in his arms. "My mommy," she whispered. A small shoe sticking out beneath a fallen beam. Head bowed like a soldier at prayer while the world finally noticed him. Frank pulled himself forward. The girl was curled up, coughing hard, face smeared with soot and tears. He was back in Kosovo, tying bandages by flashlight. He was everywhere and nowhere all at once. But he was still standing. Barely. And no one still knew what it truly took for him to do it. "It's okay," he said gently, his voice steady like a calm tide. "I've got you now." The beam across her legs was heavy, but Frank didn't panic. "Stay close," he told her. "Hold on to me." Each step hurt, his knees trembled, but his mind went somewhere else. Afghanistan, 2007. His squad hit an IED, fire everywhere, blood in his ears. A young soldier named Miller, only 19, pinned under a metal hatch. Here he was, again different time, different war, but the mission was the same. Save who you can, even when it hurts, even when no one is watching. As he neared the exit, a wall to his right gave way. Almost there, a flash of daylight peeked through the smoke ahead. A broken door. Salvation. Frank pushed forward, boots dragging, lungs aching. She's waiting, Frank said. We'll see her soon. One last push. One final step through the smoke. Around him, chaos unfolded, sirens, shouting, flashing cameras. But inside his mind, everything was quiet, because the girl was safe. That was enough. Reporters would later say the image was something they did never forget. A man with a burnt coat and bloodied boots kneeling on the ground, but Frank didn't hear them. Didn't see the cameras or the fire chief rushing toward him. He was back in a field hospital, holding pressure on a wound. Because the girl may have been the only person he carried out that day. But she wasn't the only thing he carried with him. Frank's hands were blistered, his legs shaky, and his heart pounding like a drum inside a barrel. He had made it out. The girl had survived. The cost wasn't something the cameras could see. One journalist asked, "Sir, what made you go in there?" It wasn't just the smoke or the burns or the bruises on his back. It was what the fire had taken quietly without flames. Something deeper. Something that stayed behind his eyes, even when he blinked. As paramedics treated the girl, reporters surrounded Frank. Boom mix hovered inches above his head. Cameras flashed in bursts like lightning. Frank looked up. His eyes were red, not just from smoke. He could have said instinct. He could have said habit.
Sir.
But you didn't. You went in alone. That takes guts. But he didn't. Instead, he gave a small shrug and said, "She cried for help." I answered 7 words. No drama, no speeches.
Lies.
But those words stopped the reporter cold. The fire chief approached next. Frank shook his head. "Wasn't about guts," he muttered. "Was about doing what was right." The fire chief crouched beside him. "Were you military?" Frank gave a slight nod. "Medic. Long time ago. Is she okay? Is that the man who saved her?" But that was all it took. The chief stood slowly and saluted. "Thank you," she choked out. "Thank you for saving my baby." That was all he said. And for the first time in many years, Frank Doyle was saluted not for his past, but for something he had done that very day. They helped him onto a stretcher. As the wheels rolled toward the ambulance, people clapped softly. The crowd parted. Some took off their hats. Others placed hands over hearts. Mother whispered to her son, "That's what bravery looks like." Still, Frank said nothing. The army offered him a flight home, but the plane was grounded due to weather. By the time he made it back, it was too late. He laid back, staring at the clouds overhead. His vision blurred. Was it from the smoke, or from everything else he was trying not to feel? Because what people did in TC was how tightly he held on to the girl, not just to protect her, but to remind himself that he could still do something right. He had saved lives, but not the one that mattered most. That he still mattered. That after all these years of being forgotten, discarded, and ignored, could still be someone who made a difference. The little girl's mother ran to the ambulance, crying. The EMT nodded. "She's going to be all right." Thanks to him, the mother turned to Frank, tears spilling down her face. Frank just nodded. "She was brave," he said quietly, held on tight the whole way. As the ambulance doors closed, Frank leaned back and let his eyes drift shut. But behind those closed lids, memories began to rise. Different girl, smaller, with blonde hair and a smile full of sunshine. His daughter, Lucy, he hadn't seen her in 15 years. She had died in a car crash while he was still overseas. He had missed the funeral, missed everything. That day broke him in ways no battlefield ever had. Since then, he had carried that grief like a hidden wound, and maybe, just maybe, running into that fire had been his way of trying again, trying to rewrite something that could never be undone. He couldn't bring Lucy back, but he could save one more child, could make sure this family didn't lose what he lost. Inside the hospital, as doctors treated his burns, Frank stayed quiet. Outside, the world buzzed with his name. Social media lit up. Hashtags like #HeroWithoutHome and #Frank the Brave started trending. But for Frank, none of that mattered. He had rescued a child. But he had also rescued something inside himself, something he thought was gone forever. Still, part of him couldn't shake one question. What would happen when the cameras stopped rolling? Would the world remember? Or would they go back to forgetting the man behind the smoke? The nurses gently peeled off Frank's burned coat. It came apart like paper, stiff with heat and blackened ash. Beneath it, his arms were scratched, red and blistered. But they also carried something unexpected: tattoos, faded ink, symbols of service, medical cross, a set of dog tags, and one simple line running down his forearm in rough script: "Leave no one behind." A young nurse paused, her gloved hand hovering in midair. "You were Army?" she asked gently. Frank didn't respond right away. He just stared at the ceiling. Then he gave the smallest nod. "Yeah, a long time ago." On another page was a picture: Frank in uniform, arms around two fellow soldiers. All of them young, all of them smiling, all of them still whole. The war ends for the country, not always for the soldier. The hospital staff didn't push him, but word spread fast. How did someone like that end up alone? Later that day, a woman came in holding an old file folder. She was from the local VA. Her name was Tanya. "I looked him up," she told the doctor. The tray of cookies from a third-grade class with notes like, "Sergeant First Class Francis Doyle, U.S. Army combat medic, 22 years, deployed 4 times, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan." She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of medals: 3 bronze stars, 1 purple heart, and a silver star for bravery under fire. A few veterans from the local Legion post stood silently with flags in hand. They didn't say anything. They just stood, because they understood. An older man entered, tall with gray hair and a navy pin on his collar. "I don't understand," the doctor whispered. Tanya closed the file. Outside the hospital, people gathered. Some held signs. Others brought cards. "I served in Iraq, 2006. I was there the day you pulled a wounded squad from a flipped Humvee. You saved 3 of my guys." Reporters camped near the hospital entrance. Some still trying to get a quote. Others waiting for an interview Frank had never agreed to give. Inside, Frank sat up slowly in bed. His ribs ached. His throat burned. But his mind was sharp. "We remember more than you think. Some of us never forgot. Bring the little girl's family. Invite the media." I didn't do it for that. Maybe even get a sponsor to help him off the streets. Why was this man forgotten? How many others are still out there like him? The fire had opened more than smoke-filled windows. It had opened people's eyes. He saw the flowers near the window, the balloon with "thank you" written in red letters. "You're the best fire guy. Thank you for being brave. You saved her like a superhero. Only if you talk about the others, the ones who didn't make it home." He smiled at one in particular, a crayon drawing of him holding the little girl, with flames behind them and a giant heart above their heads. It had been a long time since anyone drew him like a hero. A knock came at the door. It opened carefully. Frank Doyle. Yes, he didn't brag about the rescue. But each time he shared a quiet story, kids listened. Adults cried. Veterans nodded with eyes that had seen the same things. "I'm Captain Reese." Frank squinted. "Reese? Red Platoon." The man smiled. "That's the one." Frank looked down. Didn't think anyone remembered that day. Reese pulled a chair up beside the bed. That afternoon, the city council held an emergency meeting. They voted to give Frank a key to the city. They wanted to plan a ceremony. But when Frank was asked about it later, he shook his head. He didn't want lights or speeches, just a warm meal and a quiet space. Still, something had shifted. People began asking real questions. Frank didn't want attention, but he also didn't hide anymore. When a local school invited him to speak for Veterans Day, he said yes. When a young reporter asked to write his biography, he said he didn't mention his medals. Still, there was one thing even he hadn't told anyone yet. One person he still hadn't spoken to. Because in the crowd that watched him become a hero was someone who once called him a ghost. The first time Mason Everly saw Frank Doyle, he didn't see a veteran. He didn't even see a man. He saw a problem.
Ow.
It was a rainy Thursday. Mason had just picked up his lunch from the corner deli. As he walked outside, he spotted Frank sitting under the awning, with his blanket pulled tight. Why doesn't someone do something about guys like this? Water dripped from the edges of his coat. His cup sat untouched. Mason didn't make eye contact. He moved past, annoyed.
What?
Muttered under his breath. He didn't say it out of hate. Said it because it was easier than understanding. He'd stepped outside when the smoke started pouring from the building. He'd watched the crowd panic, the firefighters arrive, the chaos unfold. Easier than caring. He told himself, no way, that's the same guy. Can't be. And after that, he didn't think about Frank again till the day of the fire. Mason was there, worked across the street at the insurance office, and he'd seen something else. He'd seen that same old man, the one he had ignored, run into flames without a second thought. At first, Mason didn't believe his eyes. But it was. The interviews with veterans who told stories of Frank's service, the way the crowd had begun to honor him. It was Frank. The same coat, the same slow walk, the same quiet presence. Now, Mason sat in his apartment watching the news, over and over. The footage of Frank carrying the girl, the headlines calling him a homeless hero. And Mason couldn't stop thinking, how many times did I walk past that man? How many chances did I miss to just see him? A week later, Mason did something he hadn't done before. He wrote a letter. It wasn't long. Simply read, Mr. Doyle and I didn't treat you like a person. I didn't see who you really were, saw what was easy to ignore. Mason arrived first, clutching a bag of coffee and 2 sandwiches. He waited on a bench, heart pounding. You don't know me, but I've seen you before. I'm sorry. If you're ever open to a conversation, I'd like to meet and thank you properly. Hi, sir. Thank you for coming. Mason Everly. He delivered it to the hospital front desk with shaking hands. He didn't expect a reply. But 3 days later, his phone rang. Quiet voice on the other end said, This is Frank Doyle. You asked to talk. They agreed to meet at the small park by the fire station. Then Frank arrived. Same coat, same walk. But something in his posture had changed, lighter, steadier. Mason stood. Frank gave a simple nod. They sat in silence at first. Mason handed him a sandwich. Frank opened it slowly. Egg and cheese, Frank said, raising an eyebrow. I asked the deli guy what you used to get. Frank gave a tiny smile. Haven't had this in a while. Would you ever? Let me help tell your story. Not for clicks, not for headlines. Just so people don't look away again. Mason fumbled with his words. I didn't know who you were. I didn't even try. Frank stared at the pond across the park. Ducks floated by. Most people didn't, he said. That's not new, but it's wrong, Mason said, voice tight. You saved someone. You gave everything, and we'd just let you disappear. Frank took a bite, chewed, swallowed, then said something Mason never forgot. I didn't disappear. I was right here. The world just stopped looking. The words landed like a stone in Mason's chest. For the next hour, they talked. About the fire, about war, about the cost of being forgotten. And somewhere in that hour, something changed. Because Mason didn't just hear Frank's story, he felt it. He realized that redemption didn't come from saying sorry once. It came from seeing people differently every day after. By the time they stood to leave, Mason turned and said, Frank looked at him. For a long time, then he said, All right, but don't write it like I'm special. I wasn't the only one. Mason nodded. I'll tell the truth. All of it. Frank paused. Then start with this: the world didn't save me. The girl's cry did. Frank didn't ask for his name to be remembered. But sometimes, the world remembers the quiet ones the longest. The first tribute came quietly. No speeches, no news crew, just a small group of firefighters placing a framed photo of Frank inside the station's main hallway, right beside a plaque titled, Courage in the Line of Fire. Underneath his picture, the caption read, He didn't wear our uniform, but he wore our heart. Next came the mural. Local artist named Leela had seen the footage of Frank rescuing the little girl. She didn't know him. She'd never spoken to a soldier. Some cried. A few brought flowers and tucked them near the wall. But something about his eyes in that moment, the way he looked back into the smoke, stayed with her. She painted Frank onto the side of the community center wall, his silhouette wrapped in flames. A child clutched to his chest, and above his head in large white brushstrokes. And I'm here today because someone chose to help me instead of walk away. Not all heroes live in headlines. People stopped and stared. She wore a simple white dress and clutched a microphone with both hands. It would be given to students who helped others without being asked, without wanting credit, just because it was the right thing to do. Then came the school assembly. Frank's story had become the reason behind their funding, but he agreed to attend only if no one called him a symbol or a savior. Find every new bed, every new outreach call. He stood with shaking hands and didn't say much. It's just a quiet, "Thank you for seeing me." The girl Frank had saved, her name was Emily, stood on stage at her elementary school a month after the fire. And when a school volunteer brought him a copy of the program and a hand-drawn thank you card from Emily, he folded them gently and kept them inside his coat pocket, right beside the photo of his daughter. "Lucy, my name is Emily," she said softly. She turned to the crowd. That someone didn't have a house, or clean clothes, or anything special, except bravery. Her mother stood off stage, holding back tears, but strong, still strong enough to lift a child. Strong enough to carry more than pain. That day, the school announced that their new annual award would be called the Frank Doyle Medal for Quiet Bravery. Frank didn't attend the ceremony, but he heard about it. City Council followed next. For months, they'd been working with veterans groups to address homelessness. "I don't need medals. Just make sure when you walk past someone who looks invisible, you remember I was once him." He sat on a bench near the swings and watched a boy help his little sister climb the steps to the slide. Nearby, a dad pointed at the mural of Frank's rescue on a painted fence and said, "That's what real strength looks like." In VA waiting rooms, in firehouses across the state. At the next city event, they asked Frank if he'd accept a public honor. He refused the spotlight, so they didn't. They simply called him a man who reminded us to care again. At the ceremony, Frank was presented with a flag folded neatly in a wooden box. It had flown over City Hall on Veterans Day in his honor. That night, the mayor announced that the small playground near the fire scene would be renamed Doyle Park. Underneath the welcome sign was a smaller plaque, in honor of those who act when no one is watching. Frank visited the park a few weeks later. It was quiet, just like he liked it. Frank looked down at his hand, scarred now, burned, healing. Mason Everly, the man who once looked away, eventually published Frank's story, not as a headline, but as a book. The Fire and the Flag, The Life of Frank Doyle. It didn't sell millions, it didn't win prizes, but it ended up in schools. And in every copy, Mason included the last words Frank had spoken to him during their final interview. "I don't want statues." Frank never became famous, but he became something rarer. Became unforgettable. In a world that often praises noise, some stories whisper and yet echo louder than any headline. Frank Doyle's life was never meant to be a spotlight. It was a shadowed path, walked in worn boots and silent courage. He didn't ask for recognition. He never raised a banner or demanded thanks. He simply showed up. Day after day. Choice after quiet choice. But it was those very choices, small, steady, unseen, that eventually shook a city awake. People began to notice more. The diner that used to toss leftover food started making fresh meals for the local shelter. One of the firefighters who met Frank on the day of the blaze now volunteers weekly with homeless vets. A student who read Frank's story started a campaign called Blankets for the Brave. It spread across 10 schools. It wasn't just one act of heroism that moved people. It was the reminder that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks with a limp. Sometimes it carries scars. Sometimes it sits quietly on a bench, waiting not to be saved, but to save someone else. Frank's presence reminded people that every person you walk past has a history, a pain, a story. Frank nodded in thanks and stared out at the trees. He reminded them that just because someone has nothing doesn't mean they are nothing. And maybe that was his greatest gift. Months after the fire, Frank sat with his back against the same bench near the newly named Doyle Park. Spring had arrived. Own kids laughed on the swings. Flowers bloomed in the corners of the walkway. The city had come alive again. Mason Everly joined him, bringing 2 coffees. "They still remember you," Mason said. Frank chuckled softly. "They remember what happened. That's enough." Mason shook his head. No, they remember you. Frank didn't argue. He didn't need to. He looked at the small bronze plaque near his bench. The words etched into it read. He never asked to be seen. He simply stood. For a man who once believed he'd die alone in the shadows, it was more than a tribute. It was peace. Later that year, a young soldier passed through the city, fresh out of boot camp, nervous, unsure of his future. He stopped at the mural of Frank on the community center wall. He read the caption twice. Then he looked up and whispered, "Thanks for going first." And just like that, the legacy lived on, not in statues or streets, but in choices, in the decision to care, to stop, to see, to act. Because that's what Frank Doyle had taught the world. If you believe that quiet heroes deserve to be heard, then hit like, type honor in the comments, and subscribe to Silent Valor Stories. That the quietest heroes are sometimes the ones holding us all together. He didn't do it for the camera, didn't do it for applause. He did it because someone needed help. Because that's who he was. And if his story made even one person stop and look a little closer the next time they saw someone in pain, then that was enough. If you believe courage doesn't wear a price tag, if you believe respect should never come too late, because sometimes the man in the worn coat is the bravest one in the room. And if we listen closely, he just might teach us how to stand.